While sitting on a panel at the Atlanta Civil War cyclorama, a credentialed military historian took issue with my assertion that the movie Glory is historically inaccurate, particularly in the postscript when it states, "The fort was never taken." The fort being Fort Wagner, Morris Island, South Carolina. Our historian admitted that African American soldiers had occupied Fort Wagner, but insisted they had not captured it because the Confederates had abandoned it. I pointed out that when we Marines chase an enemy from a defensive position and occupy that position, we are trained to report that we have captured, we have taken that position. His reply, "My friend, that is simply your opinion." My reply, "I am not opining. I am reporting from the official records of the War of the Rebellion, in which you will find the reports written by commissioned officers, trained military men, including the General-in-Chief of the Army, Henry Halleck, stating that Fort Wagner was captured. It was taken on September 7th, 1863. You, my friend, are defending the opinions, the misinformation of movie makers writing their scripts some 100 years plus after the event, while I am reporting from the reports of trained military men who were eyewitnesses to the event." Indeed, many relied on Civil War historians are victims of such misinformation, making it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for them to identify and report relevant historical facts, especially those facts pertaining to the successful efforts of Americans of African descent to end the tyranny of slavery in league with the Constitution of the United States. This story of a mostly disenfranchised, enslaved population. I need my clicker.
Sorry about that.
That's quite all right. This story of a mostly enslaved, disenfranchised population fighting in league with the Constitution to secure their liberty has been one of the best kept secrets in American history, and it is still one of the best kept secrets in American history. Indeed, in the mid-20th century, we could say that it was a military secret, suppressed by the American military. One of the best examples of the complete suppression of this story, 1944 in movie theaters across this country, you could have seen a film produced by the U.S. government, by the War Department, the military, entitled The Negro Soldier. The director of the film was Frank Capra, arguably the top director in Hollywood at the time. In the film The Negro Soldier, they covered African-American military service in our country from the 1770s, the Revolutionary War, to the 1940s, World War II. Mentioned African-American involvement in every war in the nation's history during that period in which they were involved, except the Civil War. There was no mention of a single soldier or sailor. 10% of the Army was comprised of men of African descent. 25% of the Northern Navy. African Americans only made up 1% of the Northern population, so very clear overrepresentation. And during the Civil War, 25 men of African descent had earned the highest honor bestowed on American military personnel for acts of courage in combat, the Medal of Honor. Yet not a single one of those American heroes were mentioned in a film expressly about them, produced by the U.S. government, the War Department, the military, effectively a military secret. Our story actually begins with a secret order. They call themselves African American Mysteries, Order of Oppressed Men. This secret order had cultural and linguistic codes that were quite eloquent. And members of this organization believed that the creed of the country, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution were, quote, divine instruments of goodness, weapons that they could use to end the tyranny of slavery and gain their rights as citizens. The organ of this secret order, its newspaper, was The Mystery, founded and edited by Dr. Martin Delaney in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1843. The organ of African American Mysteries, Order of Oppressed Men, was The Mystery. Also in 1843, in Buffalo, New York, at the National Convention of the American Society of Free Persons of Color, Reverend Henry Highland Garnett put out a call for organized military efforts, to prepare for organized military efforts. Brethren, arise, arise, strike for your lives and liberty, declared Reverend Garnett. Reverend Garnett argued that it was your solemn and imperative duty to take every means that promises success to abolish slavery, arguing that violence was moral in the attempts to abolish slavery. But remember that every means that promises success, they believed that the means that promised the most success was to align themselves with the Constitution of the United States. So in league with the Constitution of the United States, they seek to end the tyranny of slavery. At that Buffalo Convention, Garnett's call for organized military effort was voted down by one vote. Frederick Douglass voted against it, so we can say that Frederick Douglass's vote was that one vote at the Buffalo Convention. Douglass called Garnett's appeal wicked, suicidal, and diabolical. Douglass also argued in 1843 that you were deceiving yourself to believe that you could work in league with the Constitution, because the Constitution, in Douglass's words, was essentially a pro-slavery document, not an anti-slavery document. Douglass would change, however, 4 years later in 1847. It begins in October of 1847 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, when Douglass is on tour with William Lloyd Garrison, and they're in the need of security. And their security in Harrisburg is provided by the Henry Highland Garnett Guards of Harrisburg, a private African-American militia. Then when Douglass reaches Pittsburgh that winter, Martin Delany convinces Frederick Douglass to join him in an effort to make the mystery directional. The mystery became the North Star, co-founded and co-edited by Martin Delany and Frederick Douglass. Douglass also, in the 1848 National Convention of the American Society of Free Persons of Color, held in Cleveland, endorses Garnett's call. And he votes in favor of a resolution advocating military training throughout African American communities in the country. Douglass also makes it very clear in 1848 that he now believes that the preamble of the Constitution is essentially anti-slavery, and that in league with that Constitution, we can end the tyranny of slavery. Between 1848 and 1858, thousands of African Americans are trained overtly in the North in private militia companies, covertly in the South, and in Canada West by the British militia. So these are well-trained men. African Americans are forecasting a civil war, and they have prepared. They have trained for it. And one of the best evidence of this forecast can be found in a speech delivered by Dr. John S. Rock on March 5th, 1858 in Boston, Massachusetts. Dr. Rock was a physician, a dentist, a school teacher, and the first African-American lawyer to be admitted to the bar of the U.S. Supreme Court. Dr. Rock said, and I quote, "Sooner or later, the clashing of arms will be heard in this country, and the black man's services will be needed. 150,000 freemen capable of bearing arms, and not all cowards and fools, and 750,000 slaves wild with the enthusiasm caused by the dawn of the glorious opportunity of being able to strike a genuine blow for freedom will be a power that the white men will be bound to respect. Will the blacks fight? Of course they will." Close quote. Clearly, 3 years before the Civil War, there's a forecast of a Civil War, clashing of arms, and a promise of 150,000 men capable of bearing arms. However, when the Civil War begins with the firing on Fort Sumter, Charleston Harbor, South Carolina on April 12, 1861, it is not legal for men of African descent to join the Federal Army. Congress had banned the enlistment of men of African descent in the Federal Army in 1792. The United States Militia Act of 1792, signed into law by President George Washington in April of 1792, restricting enlistment to the Army to, quote, able-bodied white males, close quote. But African Americans stand prepared. And did Lincoln know about it? Well, we can be certain that his head of Secret Service in the first 18 months of the war, Allen Pinkerton, knew about it. Pinkerton was a famed railroad detective and also a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Pinkerton wrote, quote, Although as yet prevented from taking up arms in defense of their rights, these colored men have banded themselves together to further the cause of freedom, close quote. Pinkerton referred to these colored men, or more appropriately these men and women of African descent, who had banded themselves together to further the cause of freedom, as members of a national organization during the Civil War called the Loyal League. It was also known as the Legal League, and in the Mississippi Valley it was known as Lincoln's Legal Loyal League, or the 4 L's. This secret African-American organization would become the single most important source of tactical and strategic intelligence during the Civil War, producing some of the top spies like Abraham Galloway of North Carolina, Harriet Tubman of Maryland. This secret African-American organization would provide the most prolific recruiters of African-Americans for the Union war effort, like Martin Delany, who recruited mostly well-trained men, and William Howard Day, who arranged, according to Delany, the Panther, who arranged recruiting among the enslaved population. This secret African-American organization had as its express goal to end the tyranny of slavery in league with the Constitution. Thus a name like the Loyal League, the Legal League, or Lincoln's Legal Loyal League, the 4 L's. This secret organization also had a great deal of confidence in Abraham Lincoln from the beginning of the war, as evidenced in a Frederick Douglass article that appeared in his monthly in August of 1861, in which Douglass writes that we have very good evidence to the fact that the Lincoln administration, notwithstanding appearances, stands ready to enforce a policy in the rebellious states that will eventually abolish slavery in those rebellious states, quote, just as soon as the people require it, close quote. Now, what does Frederick Douglass mean by as soon as the people require it? Well, the voice of the people in our government is Congress. As soon as Congress requires, as soon as Congress changes the laws. But Douglass and Lincoln do not believe that Congress will change these laws until it becomes an indispensable military necessity. So the question is, when in the collective mind of Congress did it become an indispensable military necessity? Well, in the late spring and early summer of 1862, Union General George McClellan would assemble arguably the best trained and best equipped army in the world. It was certainly the largest army in the Western Hemisphere. He would take his army to within 10 miles of the rebel capital, Richmond, Virginia. But in the first week of July, word gets to Washington that McClellan's army, the largest army in the Western Hemisphere, is in full retreat, suffering a humiliating defeat. And later that July, Congress would pass the Militia Act of 1862, granting President Lincoln the authority to employ persons of African descent in any military capacity for which he saw fit. This legislation, born of military necessity, was on President Lincoln's desk for signature on July 17, 1862. Another important piece of legislation was on President Lincoln's desk that day. It is referred to as the Second Confiscation Act. And in Section 9 of the Second Confiscation Act, Congress declared forever free all persons held as slaves by supporters of the rebellion. President Lincoln signed both these pieces of legislation into law on the 17th of July, 1862. 5 days later, he met with his cabinet. He informed his cabinet members that he was ready to issue an emancipation proclamation, gave them a draft of his proclamation, and asked for their advice. One of his cabinet members, Secretary of State William Seward, an abolitionist out of New York, advised President Lincoln not to issue the proclamation at that time. Secretary Seward argued that we've just suffered the greatest disasters of the war. And if you issue this proclamation now, after those humiliating defeats, quote, it will be viewed in the mind of the people as the last measure of an exhausted government, a cry for help, the government stretching out its hands unto Ethiopia instead of Ethiopia stretching out her hands unto the government, close quote. Seward argued that they should wait for a military success before issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. President Lincoln, calling the proclamation a practical war measure, considered Secretary Seward's advice wise advice. He waited to claim his victory. He would claim his victory on the bloodiest day, single day in American history, September 17th, 1862, a battle about 85 miles northwest of Washington near Sharpsburg, Maryland. Officially it's called the Battle of Antietam. 5 days later, September 22nd, 1862, with his victory in hand, President Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in which he warns the states in rebellion that if they do not lay down their arms and return to the Union in the next 100 days by January 1, 1863, he's going to declare free their slaves. Frederick Douglass wrote in his monthly in October 1862 that in order for the Emancipation Proclamation to free any slaves, 2 conditions had to be met. The first condition was that the states in rebellion still had to be in rebellion as of January 1, 1863. And the second condition was, quote, we must put down the rebellion. We must be able to put down the rebellion, is Frederick Douglass's argument. the day of Jubilee, December 31st, 1862, in churches throughout the North, in secret locations often called praying trees in the South, African Americans gathered for a day of Jubilee, not because on January 1, 1863, all the slaves would be set free, but because it would become legal that in league with the Constitution of the United States, they could rise up and strike a blow for liberty. On January 1, 1863, President Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation as, quote, a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, close quote. African Americans first enlisted in the Union Army in August of 1862. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, in which Lincoln orders his field commanders to receive men of African descent into all armed services of the United States, recruiting was very aggressive. Martin Delany had an office in Chicago where he recruited mostly trained men from the private militias and from the organized British militia in Canada West. These are well-trained men. So if you saw the movie Glory and they show up, they don't know their left foot from their right foot, and they bring in the Irish drill sergeant, he never existed. Robert Gould Shaw wrote, they came to camp well drilled, and the best drilled among them became our drill sergeants. His lead drill sergeant and original sergeant major was Lewis Douglas, Frederick Douglass's eldest son. They were highly trained, and Martin Delany, by contemporary scholars, is often described as a black nationalist who wanted to immigrate to Africa. Martin Delany described himself as a black national defender who had a birthright citizenship in the United States. Thousands of African Americans enlisted in 1863. And if we want to appreciate just how important these soldiers were in winning the war, we need only turn to the generals who win the war. General Ulysses S. Grant would write a letter to President Lincoln in August of 1863, telling the president, quote, by arming the Negro, we have added a powerful ally, close quote. Grant attributed African-American assistance to his capturing Vicksburg, Mississippi, which Lincoln had called the key to victory on July 4th, 1863. General William T. Sherman is often described as someone who was so racist that he wouldn't use African-American soldiers, especially in his Atlantic campaign. However, if you go to the official records and examine order of battle, you'll see very clearly that Sherman does use African-American soldiers. But General Sherman said that the great question of his Atlantic campaign was one of supplies, guarding his supply lines. And General Sherman would assign 11 United States colored troop regiments to guard his supply lines, to address the great question. And Sherman would later write that he doubted whether the history of warfare could furnish more examples of skill and bravery than those who guarded his supply line in 1864. In February 1865, Dr. Martin Delany was, on order of President Lincoln, commissioned a major of infantry in the U.S. Army Regulars, recognition of the contribution of the Loyal League and Delany's contribution in the Loyal League. Soon after Delany was commissioned, Charleston, South Carolina, the cradle of secession, was captured by African-American soldiers. On the front lines in front of Richmond, General Grant had placed United States colored troops from the 25th Army Corps. The 25th Army Corps was organized by General Benjamin F. Butler, who said of African-American soldiers, better soldiers never shouldered a musket. Butler would organize the 25th Army Corps in late 1864, and it is the only Army Corps in the history of the United States made up of only African-American regiments. And according to the official records, the 25th Army Corps captured Richmond, Virginia on April 3rd, 1865. The headlines of a D.C. newspaper, the Daily National Republican, on special edition, April 3rd, 1865, read, Extra Glorious Fall of Richmond, captured by the black troops. These soldiers would go on to stop General Robert E. Lee's army at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, forcing him to surrender there on April 9th, 1865. Their story has been and still is one of the best kept secrets in American history. It is the story of almost completely disenfranchised, enslaved population that helped maintain the supremacy of the Constitution, preserve the Union, and secure the blessings of liberty for themselves and their posterity. It is a story of American patriots, leaving us to wonder why such an inspiring, patriotic story is still one of America's best kept secrets.